The early 24th century is a period often remembered in the Federation as a golden age of peace and exploration, a simpler time in which pioneers and fledgling colonists were free to build their lives without fear or constraint. Instead, they were free to live in peace, or so it is remembered as such, with childlike nostalgia. For the people of the Cardassian Union, the early 24th century conjures a drastically different image, a desperate time in which many faced disease, poverty, and starvation. Every day, the only thought for a Cardassian was to stay alive. Today, it is viewed as the first of many trials and tests their people would go on to face throughout the 24th century. And so, as these two peoples began to come into contact, one could not ignore the disparities between the two. As the Federation colonists slept safely in warm beds with full bellies, their Cardassian fellows could only dream of such luxury, unless they could take it for themselves. In the years following the Tomed incident in 2311 and the subsequent isolation of the Romulan Empire, the Federation now had a free hand to develop and explore further into the Alpha Quadrant. For the past 2 centuries, Starfleet had remained focused on the Beta Quadrant, home of the Romulan and Klingon empires. Now Starfleet had an unprecedented opportunity to explore strange new worlds and make contact with new civilizations. At the same time, technological developments in the field of warp drive dramatically expanded the ability for Federation citizens to travel to new fertile worlds and build their lives there. This was actively encouraged by the Federation Council, who had become increasingly worried about overcrowding, destroying the natural beauty of their homeworlds. As such, Starfleet was ordered to adopt a hands-off approach to Federation colonies, only to intervene in the most dire of circumstances. There was also little anxiety among Federation leaders regarding cohabitation of new worlds with the peoples of other powers. It was assumed that the morally enlightened Federation citizens would be able to resolve disputes peacefully among themselves and potentially bridge cultural gaps on an interpersonal level. The phrase, "every Federation citizen is a diplomat," became a common slogan in the 2320s. By contrast, the early 24th century presented a grim prospect for the peoples of the Cardassian Union. The ancient and dysfunctional Hibitian way of life, which for centuries had advocated individualism, spirituality, introspection and hedonism, was finally loosening its grip on the minds of the Cardassian people, but at a great cost, causing technological stagnation, overpopulation, famine and poverty. Yet finally, in the 23rd century, the Cardassian people turned away from this way of life, after the central government, known as the Union, composed of the Central Command, represented by a sword, and the Detapa Council, represented by the Scholar's Hood, successfully defeated the Talarian. The victory cemented trust in the Union's regime, and it was hoped that the resources in the ceded territories would alleviate the suffering on Cardassia Prime. Unfortunately, the Talarians had deliberately sabotaged many of the ecosystems that they had ceded in the treaty. The Cardassians were in no position to fight another war, and so they were forced to look elsewhere. In the meantime, Central Command orchestrated the relocation of many people, including criminals and the dispossessed, moving them to what were known as reclamation colonies, on planets on the very edge of habitability. Penal colonies by any other name. The hope was that these undesirables could work to one day make the world habitable for loyal Cardassian citizens. Regardless of the successes of these colonies, the Cardassians needed food and resources immediately and could not wait to see whether these projects would bear fruit. Fortunately, a solution presented itself with the discovery of the planet Bajor. Being far larger than most M-class planets and extremely fertile, the native Bajoran population barely covered a quarter of the planet's surface, leaving plenty of room for Cardassian colonists. Indeed, many Cardassians hoped that this would prove mutually beneficial. The first colonists arriving in 2319 were greeted warmly by the Bajorans, and a prosperous trade developed between the Bajorans and Cardassians, trading crops for Jevonite, a rare, precious stone native to Cardassia. During this period, Federation and Cardassian colonies came into ever-increasing contact on the frontier. Relations were initially amicable, but hindered by significant cultural differences. Unfortunately, in 2328, Cardassia was struck by another famine. This led the Central Command to fully occupy Bajor, initially under the guise of protecting Cardassian interests. Yet it soon became clear the Bajorans were now an enslaved people. While there was no official condemnation by the Federation Council, citing the Prime Directive, it turned the opinion of many officers and people living in the frontier against the Cardassians, and many ships, including the USS Enterprise B, rescued and gave asylum to refugees. While the Prime Directive prevented direct intervention on the matter of Bajor, it also meant that when the Cardassians suffered an epidemic of Cymbeline bloodburn, resulting from the poverty and poor sanitation on Cardassian planets, the Federation did not offer them the cure, which had existed in the Federation for over a century. This led to increasing tensions between colonists on the frontier, and as a result, the Cardassians substantially increased their military presence from 2337. Later, in 2340, the Vulcan Directorate of Xenology published a paper containing accounts of the occupation of Bajor from numerous refugees. It was condemning of Cardassian actions and caused further tensions between the populations on the frontier. 2 years later, these tensions led to several xenophobically motivated riots in the frontier colonies. These led to Starfleet vessels and Cardassian warships to face off in orbit until order was restored. In order to de-escalate tensions, Starfleet withdrew much of its presence from the region. Later, in 2343, an all-out war nearly broke out during the Perona Blockade crisis, in which a Cardassian fugitive of conscience escaped to a Federation colony of Perona 4, begging for political asylum. The Cardassians blockaded the planet for 2 weeks, demanding the surrender of the fugitive. When a Starfleet task force arrived, they were forced to back down. The next year, the Cardassians issued a warning against the Federation, warning that any ship trespassing in Cardassian territory would be fired upon. The Federation responded with a similar warning. Unfortunately, this policy would change in 2346 with the election of a new president who advocated de-escalation. The Federation was desperate to avoid war. Unfortunately, the withdrawal had the opposite effect. Certain officers in Central Command, chief among them Legate Jazuk, a veteran of the Talarian War, became convinced of an imminent Federation attack. This anxiety was underpinned by the knowledge that the Federation had a significant technological advantage. In the mind of a Cardassian, it was unthinkable that the Federation would not attack. The only question was from where. The Federation colony of Setlik III was a shining example of Federation ingenuity. Barely habitable, bathed in radiation, Federation terraformers regarded it as a challenge. It had a very thin atmosphere, exposing the surface to low-level radiation, not lethal in the short term, but deadly with long-term exposure. The colonists planned to build an ozone from scratch under the cover of a localized shield. Unfortunately, primitive Cardassian sensors could not penetrate the shield, and they soon became convinced that Setlik 3 was in fact a Starfleet military installation. As such, they resolved to destroy it before it could be used against them, and so, in 2347, they launched a preemptive strike in what would be known as the Setlik 3 Massacre. The raid against Setlik 3 was led by Gul Nasat of the Sixth Order. His strike force was composed of two Natal-class cruisers, the Uzket and Mazuk, supported by a Borak-class destroyer, which served as a transport. The Natal-class heavy cruiser was introduced in 2329 as a long-range power projection cruiser optimized for patrol and counter-piracy operations in the ever-expanding frontier. It has a length of 303 meters, a width of 130 meters, and a draft of 25 meters. It has a nominal crew of 389, but this is frequently augmented with the addition of 100 ground troops. It is armed with 5 light particle cannons and 4 of the new spiral wave disruptors, weapons which are optimized for disabling enemy ships. It is also armed with one fore and one aft torpedo launcher. While it has comparatively weak shields, its hull is protected with dispersive armor, which proved impenetrable against Talarian X-ray lasers. Nasat planned to surround the Federation compound before advancing into the Dark Zone. In so doing, he hoped to capture the facility with little to no casualties and subsequently catch the Federation red-handed. Nasat would lead this attack personally from the ground. When Nasat's force arrived on the 3rd of March, the colonists were shocked by his arrival. Not knowing the Cardassians' intentions, they assumed the worst and sent out a distress signal. The colonists gathered what few weapons they had and prepared to hold out until help arrived. Fortunately, unbeknownst to Nasat, patrolling nearby was the New Orleans-class frigate, the USS Rutledge, under the command of Captain Benjamin Maxwell. Launched in 2332, the New Orleans class was the first in a new line of starships that would culminate in the famous Galaxy class. Many of the components and technology pioneered by the New Orleans would see use in the Galaxy class. Measuring in at 340 meters long, 262 meters across, and 95 meters high, she is relatively compact compared to her successors, but is well armed, boasting 7 Type 9 phaser arrays, allowing for a 360-degree arc of fire, and a fore and aft torpedo launcher. This would later be augmented by 3 additional torpedo pods, further enhancing its tactical ability. Maxwell arrived 12 hours later, after receiving the distress call. Upon entering the system, the Mazuk and Uzket moved to intercept the Rutledge. Yet they were shocked when they came under fire while still being beyond their own weapons range. The Rutledge focused its phaser fire on the Mazuk, quickly breaking its shields. This, Maxwell hoped, would persuade the Cardassians to retreat, yet they pressed their advance, and so the Rutledge torpedoed the Mazuk, destroying her utterly. With that, the Uzket withdrew, leaving the destroyer vulnerable, and she was promptly disabled by the Rutledge, although the crew would later scuttle her and evacuate to escape pods. Meanwhile, the Rutledge began beaming away teams to the surface, relieving and rescuing the besieged inhabitants. By the time they arrived, the Cardassians had seized control of the main settlement, the farm, and had established a forward operating base on the floodplain to the southeast. A total of 6 companies had been deployed, each consisting of 150 men. The surviving colonists were now dispersed into the hills in the hopes of evading the Cardassians. Maxwell deployed 250 men to the surface, leaving a skeleton crew aboard the Rutledge. Rather than face the Cardassians head-on, Maxwell organized the landing party into 5 platoons of 50. These could be more mobile than the Cardassian company, whilst preserving a reasonable tactical capability, although they were far from well equipped for the task, only carrying the No. 5 phaser. Developed at the start of the golden age of exploration, Starfleet Command felt that a less aggressive looking sidearm was called for, replacing the classical pistol shape with a smoother, more elegant curved design. Internally, it was significantly more advanced than the previous model, with a greater power reserve and up to 16 power settings, as well as a variable beam confinement, making it extremely versatile when compared to Cardassian weapons. Unfortunately, the design was significantly held back by poor aesthetic choices, which gave it poor ergonomics. With only a slight curve from the grip to its emitter, officers found it difficult to aim accurately, and this meant that many of its benefits were negated by these poor ergonomics. Fortunately for Starfleet, they were not the only ones encumbered by their equipment during this time. All Cardassian troops were equipped with the Rattler armor system. This was comprised of 2 layers. Firstly, a metallic scale undersuit. On top of this were segmented armored shells. Developed during the Talarian Wars, the armor was extremely effective against solid core projectiles, shrapnel, and X-ray lasers. Unfortunately, it proved only partially effective against phasers and significantly hindered mobility. The armor also had no insulation against the elements, significantly hindering Cardassian troops deployed to colder climates. While the Cardassians had been limited to landing via shuttlecraft, the more advanced sensors of the Rutledge were able to cut through the surface interference and beam down away teams to almost any position. As they did so, they brought with them field transporters, allowing them another ace up their sleeve. Alpha Platoon beamed into the northwestern mountain pass, along with Bravo, who would engage the Cardassian 6th Company, combing the mountains for the survivors, while Charlie Platoon evacuated survivors. Meanwhile, Delta and Echo platoons would search the river valley and western hills. 6th Company came abruptly under fire at 3 a.m. local time. The Cardassians were unaware of the Rutledge's arrival and were badly shaken, taking 15 casualties. Before they could counterattack, Charlie Platoon drove them to ground with suppressive fire. Pinned down, they called for reinforcements. 1st Company responded, abandoning its position in the settlement. Unfortunately, by the time 1st Company arrived at 0400, 6th Company was either scattered or captured. Regardless, Glyn Taylor pressed Charlie Company, hoping to trap them on the mountain. Unfortunately, he was deprived of this victory as he overran Charlie's position. They were nowhere to be found. A whole platoon had disappeared. After platoon leader Ensign Schmidt had been killed in a firefight, P.O. O'Brien took charge and, using a field transporter, allowed his men to escape the position. Meanwhile, Bravo Platoon pushed and attacked the farm held by 3rd Company, supported by Delta from the southwest. Alpha Platoon, led by Maxwell, then engaged 4th Company, holding on what was known as the Baraka encampment. He was soon joined by O'Brien and Charlie Platoon, who beamed into a position southwest of the 4th Company. Caught in the open and surrounded, Glyn Rouleau promptly surrendered. Meanwhile, Echo Platoon evaded capture by the 5th by using field transporters and captured the settlement left unoccupied by 1st Company. Then, at 0437, Bravo and Delta Platoon captured the farm. 2nd Company now found itself pinned between the settlement and the farm, and regrouped with 5th Company in the hills. 1st Company, now cut off and isolated, attempted to outflank the Starfleet position and seize the mountain pass, only to be outmaneuvered by Charlie Company, who beamed into a flanking position to the east. And by 0515, Starfleet had recaptured Setlik 3. It was only then that the crew of the Rutledge realized what had happened. In and around the settlement, bodies of the inhabitants were discovered. It quickly became clear that the Cardassians had executed their prisoners. Among the dead was Maxwell's wife and children. In total, 103 colonists had been murdered by the Cardassians. News of the massacre quickly spread throughout the Federation, and people clamoured for a Starfleet response. Meanwhile, Gul Nasat dug in on Setlik 3 with his 300 remaining men, and would not surrender until 2 weeks later, after running out of supplies, setting a pattern for the rest of the war. Many in the Federation demanded Nasat and his officers be tried as war criminals. However, nothing ever came of this, and he and his officers would be released in a prisoner exchange just a few years later, and receive no punishment for their actions. Soon after Setlik III, the Federation Council issued a statement mandating an exclusion zone around all Federation colonies. Any Cardassian ships that ventured into the zone would be destroyed. Additionally, Starfleet vessels were authorized to engage the Cardassians outside the exclusion zone if the commanding officer deemed there to be hostile intent. This was interpreted by the Cardassians as a declaration of open season on any and all Cardassian ships. Therefore, the head of Central Command and de facto ruler of the Cardassian Union, Gultar Obrek, issued a statement laying claim to numerous worlds in the frontier and stating his firm intention to see any form of Federation presence, be it civilian or military, driven out, by force if necessary. And so, while no formal declaration of war had been issued, a de facto state of war now existed between the Federation and Cardassian Union. Unfortunately for the Cardassians, they were rapidly realizing just how outmatched they were, losing a total of 21 ships and 50 suffering heavy damage, all in the first 6 months. During this time, a total of 32 engagements had occurred, all of which had ended in a Starfleet victory. Conversely, Starfleet had only lost 3 ships, all of which were older models, with only a dozen or so ever returning to a starbase for repairs. Starfleet was able to achieve this superiority by actively preempting Cardassian raids, attacking and breaking up Cardassian squadrons before they could be fully formed. This prevented the Cardassians from engaging in any large-scale efforts. In this period, Starfleet saw no need to take further action, and it was anticipated that the Cardassians would soon face facts and back down. This may have been the case. Unfortunately, on September 13th, this was derailed by the highly controversial destruction of the Cardassian ship Tazara. The captain of the USS Crazy Horse, Perona, attacked and destroyed a Cardassian supply ship, the Tazara, in the Bremer sector, believing it to be transporting military supplies. However, upon investigation of the wreckage, the bodies of over 300 Cardassian civilians were found. Captain Perona was tried by court-martial and relieved of command. Even so, the damage had already been done, and many in the Federation Council were now of the opinion that such a tragedy was a result of Starfleet overzealousness, and as such, Starfleet was now forbidden from seeking engagement outside the exclusion zones. Many Starfleet officers protested this decision, as it undermined 6 months of victory. Others believed, and indeed still believe today, that the incident was engineered by the Cardassians in the hope of reversing Federation policy, which had hitherto rendered them on the back foot. Even so, the Cardassians had realized how grievously outmatched they truly were by Starfleet vessels. As such, Jagul Gamor suggested they force Starfleet into fighting battles on Cardassian terms, that was, on the ground. Setlik III had demonstrated how well-entrenched units could tie down Starfleet forces for a long time, and utilizing transport inhibitors, they would likely have the advantage. The only hurdle was reaching the planet's surface itself. Gamor concluded that the best way of doing so, rather than deploying a carrier, which would be vulnerable, they would instead warp rush the planet, ideally coming out of warp in the gravity well, so that Starfleet could not open fire without risking damage to the planet's surface. If successful, they could beach their ships on the surface and use it as a strong point, potentially even being able to provide local fire support. The ships most frequently used in these operations were the Setlik-class escort. It is optimized for close-range battle and system defense. Unfortunately, they were rendered obsolete by the time of the war. Thus, using them in these warp rush operations, they could at least keep Cardassia in the fight, while newer classes were under construction. These warp rush operations proved immensely successful, and soon Starfleet found itself engaged on the ground across 14 systems, involving a total of 25,000 troops. For the next 3 years, Starfleet would find itself bogged down in ground battles across the frontier. All the while, the Cardassians busied themselves constructing a new fleet, one that would put the Federation to flight and win the war.